go? Or? You can also log in the middle, just to, if you can open the video. Yeah. All right. So today we're back on a fairly interesting topic we've discussed before. So a few months ago, you may still have a bit of a recollection that the young lights and the Kolel and beyond were storming about the topic of the guidance that's given to Chassanim, to young lights, that whole topic. And due to the fact that it was a major topic at the time, so I felt the need to address, to discuss in a public venue, and to give my humble contribution to this topic, to clarifying, to getting additional clarity on this sensitive and very personal type of topic. The general reaction at the time seemed to be fairly positive. I got some positive feedback at the time, and definitely seemed to be very much of interest. And without it being posted anywhere, as far as I know, I can tell you that there were many hundreds of hours of watch time, so it seems to be filling some kind of need, or however you'd like to put it, but it seemed like a topic that its time had come to be discussed in some form in public. Now in the days and weeks that followed, so I came across, as one tends to do, I came across additional material, additional sources and discussions that touched on the matters that were discussed. I also received a small number of responses, feedback that touched a bit on the teichen, that touched on some of the points that were discussed. At the time, though, I wasn't consciously trying to accumulate and assemble more material for a follow-up. It was just continued discussion, Shraga afterwards. But in addition to all of that, in the months that followed, continued thinking on and off about particularly the perspective of Chassidus, what Chassidus has to say on these topics. And a number of points from a slightly different perspective sort of became clearer to me. Until the last month or two, I started thinking to myself that, hey, you know what, maybe Itaka is Kedai to touch again on this topic, on the subject, and do a continuation. I just want to clarify the many disclaimers that go here before we continue, that I'm aware that there is no particular background, no particular trigger at this time for returning to this topic. No one was discussing it, no one was asking, and I actually do genuinely feel a little less comfortable with just unprompted getting back on this topic. I even felt, I could say, a bit of a conflict while I was preparing, going through the preparation for discussing this. Made the process a little more difficult. I hope it doesn't make you feel too uncomfortable. But my reasoning is that if it seemed to be a fairly large consensus among many that there was a teyelis, there was a benefit at the time, and speaking about this then. By the way, of course, there were others that I'm sure were of the opinion that it's not really a matter that's for public consumption to be aired out in this fashion. So as a Maimer Musker, I just want to point out, parenthetically, if you look in the Akdama to the Sefer, we have Piskei Be'er Moshe, which is from the Mamali Makam, the successors of the Dovid Tziner, who collected his psakim on Hilchas Nida, etc. So they actually mention in the Hakdama, or the introductory material, that he pioneered giving shiurim in Hilchas Nida, Pashut and regular Hilchas Taras HaMishpacha. He pioneered giving these types of shiurim in public, and at the time it was considered a novelty. And up until then, it had not really been acceptable. And he felt, for his reasons, that this is necessary. And I think it's fair to say that subsequently it's pretty much caught on, it's pretty much been normalized and mainstreamed in many places, including in our community. So I would suggest that perhaps we can make a comparison, we can equate these matters, which are considered even a bit more sensitive, to that, and particularly in light of the fact that, as I want to get to, I reminded myself after the last discussion, and in fact the Rebbe essentially brought this topic up in public, in Sichos and Verbrengens, a number of times over the years, obviously in the Rebbe's Sgan, but that's one of the things that I want to get to, Mirz Hashem. So it is something that Rebbe kept alive and raised unprompted a number of times in public. At any rate, whatever your opinion on that question is, we obviously can't just go back and forth on it endlessly. So, for those who agreed and accepted that it was a good idea to talk about it last time, so Mistama can't hurt to continue to add additional information, additional details, additional perspective, and in particular, in the light of the fact that I said that I actually want to present a slightly different perspective from Chassidus itself. And another disclaimer, another thing to emphasize, as I emphasized last time, that this is not about mixing in, as we say, intervening in people's lives, telling people what to do. Not here to paskin, quote unquote, this is good, this is bad. Seif kol seif, we know that within Yiddishkeit, within halacha, there's a large range of opinion. Like we mentioned, we'll mention again, the Rambam, of course, most famously. On the other hand, though, it's generally accepted, the standard generally is that when one speaks in public about shittas and ashkafas, so we generally strive to remain as loyal as we can to the spirit of what the Rabbi taught, what Chassidus says, what Chabad believes, to stick to those makayres. That doesn't mean that a large portion of us, including people present here, ourselves, whether matters big or small, doesn't mean we always live up to those standards, to those expectations, but poyel mamash. So there's always going to be a bit of a gap between the ideal and what's happening in reality. And it could also be true that by only emphasizing the more extreme words that are on the books, it could cause harm, it could cause damage to people that misapply it, and can cause people's lives to be distressed. So it's very possible that those that are more intimately involved in what's going on an individual level will feel the need to address that in public and to provide other opinions, other perspectives, but I still believe that it's very important nicht zu sein genart. When it comes to what our Makayros say, what Chassidus says, if you have other reasons, you have reasons to provide other opinions, other perspective in addition to Chassidus, that's fair. You can make your case, you can make your argument, and we can evaluate it. But let's at least be honest about what the different Makayros say and why we're choosing what we're choosing. Everything has its proper place. So this is all just to establish, for the record, what Shittas Chabad is, what the classic Chassidish Hashkafa is, and then the discussion can continue from there in a sensitive, serious fashion as to what that means practically on a day-to-day basis. So getting to the actual substance here. So on the previous occasion, the two main categories that were discussed. So number one was what I called B'lashon Nekiya Siman Reish Mem, meaning certain things that are asur, certain things that are mutter. And additionally, there was perhaps an equally big question or a bigger question as to what's the hashkafa, what's the person's mindset, where a person's mind is supposed to be according to Chassidus. So really, what I really wanted to elaborate on this occasion was the second point, like I said. But there is one point that I wanted to add regarding the first topic. So we're going to start with that, and then we can move on from there. Just based on the amount of preparation and the amount of time we're working with, we're going to end up disproportionately focusing on that first, and hopefully, Be'ezus Hashem, there'll have to be a hemshech to the hemshech. So getting back to Simnei Reish Mem. So the way I presented things back then, so I said, look, everyone knows, there's the sheet of the Rambam. The Rambam essentially, straight out, goes on the record and says, Kol ma she'adam reitzeh lasos, he can do. But by presentation, took the Shulchan Aruch, what Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber writes in Shulchan Aruch and Simnei Reish Mem, and sort of based the discussion on that, and that, so making the argument that that's what we consider to be mechayev. That's the main standard that's become ungenommen to follow, at least officially, at least publicly. And of course, there may always be others that want to argue that they personally want to follow other shittas, or they want to fartaich the Shulchan Aruch itself. This is all what we discussed at the time. There was one point that I heard afterwards from one or two people. I think there's even someone who wrote a comment on the YouTube video a few months later, that what about the Rama? You didn't mention that there's a Rama in Even Ezer. You're focusing the whole time on the Mechaber and Eirach Chaim Simnei Reish Mem. There's enough in the Rama, seemingly. To the contrary, in Even Ezer, Siman Chavei, because Siman Chavei and Simnei Reish Mem have a lot of overlap. They deal with a lot of similar things, but there also are differences. That itself is a topic people like to discuss. One of the things you see in Even Ezer, Siman Chavei, is that in Sif Beis, the Mechaber writes, etc. They shouldn't be talking about other things, etc. Then there's a Rama. Rama has a Haggah. The Rama writes as follows, I'll quote, B'yochel lasis im ishtoi ma sheyirtze, boyel b'chalei sheyirtze, menashik b'chalei v'sheyirtze, u'bo'aleh ben kedarka ben shaloi kedarka, iderech ivarim, u'avad shaloi yoytzi zera levatala, V'yesh mekilim v'oimrim shemuter shaloi kedarka, afilu yoytzi zera, meisa ba'akrai, v'ein iragel b'kach, v'af al pi shemuter b'kolel, kol ha'mekadosh atzmei v'muter loi, kadosh yoimru loi. That's the lashon of the Rama in Even Ezer Siman Chavei. So the argument is, it seems to transpire, it turns out, seemingly, that the Rama has the identical position as the Rambam. So if we're purporting to speak in the name of Shulchan Aruch, so actually both opinions, both positions have equal representation in Shulchan Aruch. And if anything, the Rama is the Pesach for Ashkenaz. He agrees with the Rambam. So my response at the time, and now I'll discuss it here directly. My response is that I was certainly aware for quite a number of years about this Rama's existence, certainly long before the Shiur. But just on a practical level, I'll explain in a moment why I didn't think it was directly relevant to my presentation. And on a practical level, when you're delivering a shiur, when you're preparing to deliver a shiur, you have to make editorial decisions as to what you're going to include and what you don't have time to get into. You want things to present themselves fairly clearly. You don't want to have a lot of ins and outs and backs and forths, especially considering this is only one detail of many within a shiur. So it's never possible to get into every shakla v'tari and every possible question, every possible answer. That was why I didn't end up mentioning it. But if you want to know, what's the story with the Rama? So if you take the words of the Rambam and the Rama at face value, just take those words. So those words themselves are not, in fact, don't seem to be directly addressing this particular topic that we were discussing. The particular topic we were discussing was what the Shulchan Aruch calls derech azos, and is it asur or is isur the wrong word? That particular concept is not addressed directly in these words. So why did I say that the Rambam holds that all of these things are okay? Because in the Rambam, in the context of the Rambam, if you read everything he has to say on the topic, it's strongly implied, understood from the entirety of what he says. Why? Because the Rambam doesn't mention any of these other chashashas at all. Doesn't say it's good, doesn't say it's bad. So essentially he's mashmit, he omits this entire sugya. So when he omits, when he leaves all those things out, then he says, Kol ma sh'adam reitz elasis oiseh, so it's understood that literally everything of any type is fine with the Rama. When it comes to the Rama, we can make a different argument. We can say that the Rama, within this particular context in Shulchan Aruch, even though he's using the same words, but those words themselves, and in this particular context, should only be understood to be referring to the things that he actually mentions outright. What are those things that he mentions outright? Baya b'chalei sheyirtze, menashik b'chalei v'sheyirtze, uba'ala ben kadarka ben shalei kadarka, etc. And the introduction, v'yochal asas ha'mishtim ha'sheyirtze, is more of a hakdama to the things he's about to elaborate. But there is no direct discussion here, there is no direct acknowledgement here of these other things, which in this case were spelled out explicitly by the Mechaber in other seifim, not the thing we're talking about, but other things are elaborated upon by the Mechaber in other seifim in Simcha Fei, as well as the things that are discussed in other simanim, Siman Reish Mem and Shulchan Aruch, which the Rama did not comment on. And this is typical, I would say, for the Rama, that often the Rama uses language that came from earlier sources, but doesn't always necessarily mean that he has the identical position with those earlier sources. It might change a word, or depending on the context, you might understand that he's applying it in a more specific way. So again, Meila, talking about the Rambam, he never mentioned it at all. And also, if you think about it, these types of things, the Gemara being chayshish and saying this is going to cause that and that's going to cause that, it doesn't seem like something that Rambam is very much into anyway. Mashenken the Rama could say the Rama might be chayshish for things that are described as a sakana, and the Rama is only coming to make a more narrow point, that what right the husband has to his wife, or what's mutter aser from Kedusha inyanim, not sakana inyanim. Of course, this is something that one can debate further. But my point is that it's far less obvious and understood and implied from the Rama the way it is from the Rambam. So you can't just trot out the Rama as if the Rama is clearly on the record saying something specifically directly to this point. Another argument, another point, maybe more importantly, is that it's not just me that's making this claim, although I'm representing myself that's how I would read the Rama myself if you asked me, but it's not just me. You can look at the Achreinim that touch on these matters between the time that elapsed between the Rama and this day and age. Right? We're not living in a vacuum here. It's not like we have to rediscover the Shulchan Aruch and reinterpret the Shulchan Aruch anew. There's a few hundred years of precedent in between, so perhaps there's a clue to be found there. And as far to date, I have not yet seen any noted achreinim that explicitly or in any way interpret the Rama in the way that the people making this argument want to interpret the Rama. That, in other words, that the Rama is in this seif Beis in Siman Chavei, when there are many other seifim, etc., to come and say that the Rama actually, this is his disclaimer, and he's really disagreeing with the Mechaber in every single prat, everything the Mechaber said. This is not something I have seen Achreinim come straight out and say. As if, like, okay, now every single point, Mechaber says this, Rama says that, Mechaber says this, Rama says that, we should give the Rama preference because Ashkenaz. No, when the Achreinim deal with the Yonim and Siman Reish Mem, I haven't seen anyone say, oh, but the Rama and Simcha Vei says that none of this is applicable. Last time we got a little bit into Derech Azaz, quoted the Chidah, quoted the Marsham, and how they discussed it didn't notice that any of them said, oh, but this whole discussion is irrelevant because there's Dr. Rama and Simcha Vei. That's not the tone that I've seen in the Sfarim that discuss this on the record. Masha'en Kain, that this is Derech Hazos. Masha'en Kain, when it comes to Shalei Kedarka, which one might have thought should be treated more severely, perhaps. I don't know if anybody's thought about it, but maybe Shalei Kedarka seems more severe of a breach, which, by the way, the Mechaber does not mention at all. Interestingly, not in Siman Reish Mem, and not in Siman Chafei. It doesn't say those words at all. But Taka, if you look at how Achreinim talk about it, it does look like that the tone is slightly more lenient about Shalei Kedarka versus Derech Hazos because of the influence of the explicit words of the Rama. Well, when I got married, so I was in touch with a Chassidish Chassan teacher, and it's not like I sat with him for many hours and days. Just for a couple of hours, and most of it probably wasn't about halacha and minig, it was probably more practical and technical. I don't have any specific memory as to whether he even discussed or addressed these issues, but I certainly don't remember that he was mekel or mat or anything. At any rate, at the time he said, you want a sefer, you want to have a question, you have something you want to clarify on these matters, so there's a sefer, Fakal Tanavcha. The name of the sefer is based on a pasuk somewhere. Fakal Danavcha is a small sefer in the contemporary halacha format where you have the pnim organized by topic, and then you have the ha'aris with elaboration. So he said that's the sefer, that's the go-to sefer. So at the time I bought a copy. It's also in Hebrew books. It's on Etzer Chachma. I think someone asked me something subsequently related to these halachas. I suggested, look at Fakal Danavcha. You'll see it's addressed. I believe, my impression is that this Sefer Taka represents the classic Chassidish Haredi approach up until more recent developments, where now we're hearing other voices, other ideas, other arguments. But this represents the traditional approach. So if you look on the appropriate page, so you'll see when it comes to Shalei Kedarka, he writes, Asur liyas ragil. Shouldn't be habitual. Kedusha gamba krailoi. That's what he writes in the Pnim. Based on the way the Rama wrote it. Rama also wrote Mederach Kedusha not. And of course the marker is the Rama. And then in the next ice, when it comes to Derech Hazos, he just says, it's a Derech Hazos. Doesn't doesn't loop the Rama in. So that's just this is the traditional way people have read these Paiskim have read these Simanim and how they've processed the information, unlike this argument that's being made. And finally, just a final point in argument on this matter. Lamar Zogin, let's say you still disagree. Say, no. I read the Rama, and I personally am fully convinced that the Rama meant to say that everything is fine, and anyone who says otherwise must have misunderstood the Rama. And from the moment we've clarified and rediscovered the true sheet of the Rama, so who could disagree with the Rama? So to that I would say, this is a shtickle, more of a theory, but I feel like sharing it, so enjoy. To look at Shulchan Aruch and Mechaber and Rama as always just being a Sephardi Ashkenazi dichotomy, binary, and so if all else is equal and the Mechaber says something and the Rama says something, so just go with the Rama because Ashkenaz, that's not the only line of division that we find in Shulchan Aruch. And there's another division that we find, in my opinion. Like I said, this is I'm stating it this way. And Behaktim, that already a long time ago I saw a discussion, someone was asking, Chassidim, especially Chabad Chassidim, we learn Chassidus, it's part of the curriculum in yeshiva, starting from a very young age, but everyone in yeshiva is of a young age. It's hapech often in Shulchan Aruch in Yeridei Seminary Shmem Vav Hilchos Talmud Torah. The Rama says, "Ve'ein la'adam l'ilmod ki'im mikra mishnah gemara v'hapaiskim hanamshachim achareim." That's what one should be learning. U'bezeh yikna ha'olam hazeh v'ha'olam haba. That's what you need to do to be a good Jew. Avaloi b'limud sha'ar ha'chachmis. Everything else, that's not necessary. That's not the point. But here and there, the use of the word ba'akrai, you can learn sh'ar chachmas, not to compare the two. And this is using language from the Rambam here, but these other chachmas, whatever they may be, other intellectual pursuits, that's the til b'pardes. Ve'en l'adam l'til b'pardes rak la'achar shemile kreisoi basar v'yayin. And even if you're going to pursue that, but you have to first establish that you filled your stomach with the real food, the basar v'yayin, iser, heter, dinim. So the Shach, Sifkat Nevav, commenting on the Rama, says, Shar Chachmas, what are Shar Chachmas? Kegoyin, he mentions other things, and he says, Chachmas ha-Kabbalah v'chayetze ben. From the tone of the Rama, it's understood that Kabbalah is excluded from Mikra Mishnah Gemara Paiskim and Mutter Aser and Isser V'Heter and Dinei HaMitzvahs. So Chachmas HaKabbalah is also in this category. And then the Shach discusses a bit further and he concludes that Kabbalah and other Achrayim, they've all warned not to learn Chachmas HaKabbalah until after Shemilei Kreisei Me'ashat, which is the term you see a lot in these discussions. Some say to wait till 40, there's an age limit. Ben Arboim Labina, you also need Kedusha and Tara and Zrizas and Nikiyos to start learning these things. And whoever tried earlier, most of those who tried earlier, didn't end well. So this is the Shach, but it seems to be pretty much in line. He's elaborating, he's articulating the Rama, what the Rama's position is. So the fact that we're learning other things, we're learning Pnimis HaTorah in great amounts, essentially parallel to the more traditional limudim in yeshiva, seemingly is at odds with often Psak Din and Shulchan Aruch, the Rama and the Shach. What's going on? So someone asked this question a number of years ago. Some people were trying to answer, give chilukim. The Rama and the Shach didn't mean chassidus. They meant, I don't think that's true to Pshat and Rama and Shach. So my suggestion was as follows: a bit of a historical view. We know in the last 1,000 years there are different schools of thought within Klal Yisrael as to the importance of learning other inyanim beyond Gemara and Halacha, what the Rama and the Shach are calling Sh'ar HaChachmas. And particularly, there was this agreement applied to learning Kabbalah. So for the last 500 years or so, approximately from when the printing press was invented, because apparently that really had a very powerful role in spreading Sifrei Kabbalah and popularizing them. So we've had these disagreements specifically about Kabbalah. Those who are on the record in favor of promoting spreading Kabbalah as much as possible, and those who take a different view. They prefer that it be limited to whatever extent. This is not just Hegena. The Frierdiker Rebbe also, Sefer Zechariah, presents this disagreement in the Frierdiker Rebbe's Sgan. So, with that in mind, I would say that the Rama and the Shach essentially should be counted among those who belong to the group that say that less is better. We're not looking to spread Kabbalah as much as possible. That includes limits on the age. We'll try to keep people away from it at least as long as we can, till age 40. That type of language, that type of statement is clearly coming from a desire to limit how much Kabbalah, how much Pnimis HaTorah is being learned. That is their shitta. That's the shitta that they subscribe to. But at the very, very same time, literally at the same time, there lived someone known as the Arizal, his yard site now. Arizal wrote, mitzvah v'simcha legaler zeis ha'chachma. The Alter Rebbe quotes it. So Arizal is saying, and Arizal obviously was very young, and he had Talmidim that were young. The Rama preceded Arizal, also started very young. Clearly in these circles there was no age limit and no fundamental limitation. Obviously it's always understood that someone who's learning it should be learning it appropriately with the right mindset and not the wrong mindset. But they belonged to a time and place where there was Hafatzas HaKabbalah, and they were being Meifetz Kabbalah. The Ramak wrote the Pardes, that was itself was a powerful tool for spreading Kabbalah. The Kisvei Arizal were spread by his Talmidim, and were very, very powerful and very influential. Specifically, his Talmidav in Italy, that was the country outside of Eretz Yisrael where Kabbalah Mamash caught on under the influence of the Ramak and the Arizal. And they were being Meifetz Kabbalah. That's where you see it. That's like an example of a place where you see they're being Meifetz Kabbalah, they're spreading it, halacha l'maisa, and many were learning it from the youngest ages. So you have these two things happening at the same time. Now, Chassidus, the Chassidic movement, obviously views itself as being in a straight line from the Arizal. Mechaber himself, Rabbi Yosef Karo, also should seemingly be viewed generally as belonging. He was a contemporary of the Arizal, etc. Wasn't a Talmud Mamish, as we know, various stories, but belonged to the same general circles, involved in Kabbalah, etc. So Bazoi, you come in asking a kasha. How could it be that we're doing this? What about the Rama? We can stick fragen a kasha from the Rama. Obviously, if you would have rewind in time, you would see that Rama has this shitta, the Arizal has this shitta, and these matters we obviously belong to the Arizal's base medrash. And if the Rama came to us personally and said, well, you're not listening to me, we would say, sorry, the Arizal, we're Talmidim the Arizal in these inyanim. So the point is that not everything divides along the lines of Sfardim and Ashkenazim, and sometimes there are other divisions. And that's just a very strong elaboration of the point, which the real point is that, like I said earlier, it's not like we're rediscovering the Shulchan Aruch now. There's context as to how din of Shulchan Aruch get applied, halacha l'maisa. So in this particular matter, this seems more like a ruchnistika type of shaila. Your perspective on ruchnias and the amount of influence that spirituality, mysticism, whatever words you want to use, impact your hashkafa and Yiddishkeit, probably will have a very strong impact on how you would respond to this question, which is literally what we still see till today, as I touched on a bit last time, and I want to touch on, I guess, in a continuation. The more Chassidish, the more influenced by Kabbalah Chassidus you are, the more likely you are to go in one direction, and the less influenced you are, the more likely you are to go in the other direction. So it could very well be that in this matter, the Rama is taka following the Rambam, because the Rama identified more with that type of outlook, more philosophical, less mystical, and the Mechaber was the opposite. We know the Mechaber was pretty anti-philosophical and certainly very mystical. So that would just be another way of explaining why we might identify more with the Mechaber here versus the Rama, even if you want to argue that the Rama Taka disagrees with the Mechaber in every detail, which is not even a premise that I accept. So we have to pause here. I'll just to give you a sense of what else I want to discuss. So first of all, last time I presented, I said there's a Chassidish Shita and there's a Misnagdish Shita, and I used the words of Rabbi Isaac Sher specifically. So subsequently I've seen that it's not just Rabbi Isaac Sher. We have some of the big names that get a trigger warning before you mention them in a Lubavitcher Beis Medrash. Some of those names are associated with this new line of thinking in the Litvischer world. So that's one thing I want to get to. Another thing I want to get to, on the contrary, we're discussing as to like Poyel Mamish, halacha l'maisa, what are we asking of people? What are we demanding of people? So it's interesting to point out that there's actually a very interesting letter from the Mashkiach in Yeshivas Chachmi Lublin. We know that he was connected to Chabad. He had a very interesting person. I guess we can elaborate on it if we continue. So Shimel Ezelachaver has a letter that It's becoming slightly more famous as the days and weeks go on, but it's still not very well known, where he essentially takes a more practical approach and says, okay, we need to be practical. What's actually reasonable to expect from human beings? He also has an interesting Rabbi, I don't remember the exact, I think Rabbi Moshe Yechiel Elimelech of Levertov, who also wrote interesting things. So this is some material that I want to get to. Like I said, I want to get to the Rebbe, how the Rebbe, on the other hand, or the first hand, spoke about Shei Kaddish Atzmai a number of times in public, and tied it to the union of chinuch, which is one of the powerful arguments when it comes to these matters, as to why we can't just pick and choose what opinions speak to us more personally, because there's that impact on one's children. So that's something that the Rebbe mentioned a number of times I want to get to. And then I want to get to a number of more interesting Mekaydes Chassidus. Last time we spoke about some Mekaydes Chassidus about Shei Kaddish Atzmai and all that, more negative, quote unquote, but there are actually a lot of interesting Mekaydes Chassidus that provide a more positive approach to Inyan HaZivug, or even the fact that a person has to contend with these urges. That's not just a bad or a dirty thing, that there's more significance to that. So that's all what I'd like to cover, Mitzvah Hashem, in the following parts. Shabbos.
This is the share the previous one you gave?
Yeah.
You don't know something specific. You're saying there's things that are mud and fire, and then there's their chazos. You're saying specifically their chazos.
The context then was Hila Maila V'Hula Mata.
Nothing else, right?
I was reacting to specific things. We'll try to craft